Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra,
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people.
associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked.
and sometimes what didn't,
You will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts.
And inspire you to do even greater things.
Today, my guest is Harpreet Singh, the co-founder and co-CEO of Launchable. In this conversation, Harpreet talks about his career path and how he came to lead the startup Launchable. He also talks about the importance of continuous learning, about aspects related to scaling himself. And when I asked him about his own time management approaches, he talks about how he does that. Then we touch upon documentation and the importance of finding a niche and how we can create value in that niche. He also describes the solution from Launchable as to how that uses machine learning to predict which tests are likely to fail, thereby making the overall confidence in a launch much higher. We'll touch upon the impact of coding style and how his leadership style and his approach to building a team has helped him come up with innovative applications of AI and machine learning in the Launchable software delivery platform. He also has tips for both people entering tech or considering a career in tech, as well as people considering a career change. But in general, says if you enjoy learning and tackling new challenges, tech industry offers a dynamic and rewarding environment, and the importance of focusing on your own why. Listen on. Harpreet, welcome to the Software People Stories.
Hi, Shiv. Very nice to be here. Thank you for hosting me.
Yeah, I'm glad. When your name was first proposed, I was quite curious. So I have a lot of questions, which is not normal because I have been mostly approaching guests with a completely open mind and then going there. But after looking at your career, I mean, there are some things which I can relate to. So probably that will come up sometime in the conversation. But yeah, before I get ahead of myself, we can start with your origin story, how you got into IT, and then your professional trajectory, and then we'll take it from there.
Oh, well, how I got into IT kind of gives away my age. Been a while. I think when I graduated, computers was just something that was coming along on the scene. And this is high school, like, 12th standard. In Bombay, it's a college. So I was there. I'd taken a few very simple courses, none about programming at that point. And I just found the world very fascinating. In When I graduated from high school, electronics was the go-to career. And I remember telling myself, no, not electronics. I'm going to go in computer science and computer engineering. And a bunch of people told me, like, what the hell are you doing? And I ended up there. I went to a college called Pune Institute of Computer Technology, PICT. It's based out of Pune. A wonderful college. And I loved it. And so I've been in it for a while. And from a trajectory perspective, I joined a company called Persistent Systems. It was in Pune. It was a startup at that point, and I worked for the CEO Anand. And I believe Persistent is huge in India now.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot from him. One of the things I learned is like, well, I nearly don't know enough that I thought as a college student I knew. And I decided to come to the US to do a master's. I did a master's in computer science from University of Cincinnati. There was a company called Sun Microsystems that was building a language that I loved called Java. I joined them as an intern and got hired by them for Java Enterprise Edition, Java EE, J2 EE. I was there for about 10 years. Along the way, I decided to do an MBA. I did an MBA from Santa Clara University. After about 10 years, I was like, I need to be in a startup. I'm kind of done with the big company thing.
Mm.
I joined a company called CloudBees, which was less than 10 people at that time. I helped scale it to about 500 people. And 8 years later, I went to a company called Atlassian, which does Jira. I headed their Bitbucket product line. And I figured, you know what? If I come to if I live in Silicon Valley and I've never opened my own startup, I'm doing disservice to my Indian roots.
Mhm.
So I started Launchable. It's been 4 years since I started this. And that, in a nutshell, is my journey here.
Yeah, fascinating. I could relate to some of the things that you said. Absolutely. Again, I don't think I need to say anything for people to guess my age. I guess my kind of tells it. Yeah, I was also interested in hardware, but then
Uh-huh.
somehow the fate of this thing. No? A friend of mine is the one who introduced me to software, and then he got into hardware, I got into software, and the whole thing changed. Uh, yeah, I can absolutely relate to that. Yes, and persistent also. And I had a few friends there
Uh,
those days. Yeah, so now when you said that you've had a liking for software and you've been with some of the companies that probably were or still are pioneers in what they were doing. The
uh-huh.
Sun used to be the gold standard for very high-end, good computing, networking,
Right.
and everything else. Uh, so you, in a way, it's probably one inference that I'm drawing is that you've been on the edge of technology.
Uh-huh.
On now, when you work in those kinds of areas, when there are probably not too many precedences, or when you're growing a company, like you said, from being a very small to a few hundred people and all that, uh,
Yeah.
how did you handle scaling yourself?
Scaling myself.
Yeah.
Um,
Because in college or this thing, we write small programs which probably maybe maximum 2-3 persons write it. And then you start
yeah.
getting into larger systems which are going to be probably used by a lot more people. Just thinking scale, handling that kind of scale, whether it is people, whether it is the technology, whether it's a process.
I think this has different answers to each of these components. So I'll speak to the personal aspect because that's where you
Okay, yeah,
started.
right.
Um, I'm a big fan of Kaizen or continuous, learning,
Mhm.
and continuous improvement.
Mm.
Uh, and so from wherever I know, I seem to have this bug that, you know, uh, I'm going to read up a lot. Um, I'm going to, take a lot of courses. I just This just came up from Satya Nadella's something where he just talked about he does a lot of courses, he does a lot of reading. He may not read it all, he may not finish it all, but like that sort of growth mindset. Um, that I looked at that and I was like, that's me actually. So I always had that. Um, I remember like in like ninth grade, my parents bought me an encyclopedia, and I spent the next summer just completely reading it Z,
Wow.
so that nobody could beat me in
Yeah.
general knowledge
Mm.
competitions in school. I ended up standing third in Bombay at some point. So that mindset I always had. So I'm always looking to improve. I'm always picking up. I'm a student always,
Mm.
and so that's who I am. And so like that's what has helped me scale. I'm willing to admit that I don't know. I'm willing to admit I'm wrong,
Mhm.
and I'm willing to admit I'm not the smartest person in the room, right? And then I go like, all right, I'm going to learn, and
Mm.
that's what I do.
Mm. Sounds very simple, but I'm sure it takes a lot of discipline to be
It
conscious.
certainly makes you end of lighthearted jokes. My
Mhm.
Some of my friends just say like, all right, you just ask him. He's probably taken a course on it or he's read a book about it somewhere, and that usually is the answer. Yes, I have done it.
Yeah. Uh, so on a related point on scaling
Hmm.
is also about managing time.
Uh-huh.
When you want to do more, and particularly with more people, every person that you interact with is going to need some time.
Yeah.
So how did that aspect play out for you?
So managing time with people, I tend to think that so we are lucky in the tech industry that we bring in the smartest people. And one of the benefits actually of working in startups are people are very forward leaning themselves. They tend to have that growth mindset themselves. So if I provide them enough context on why I'm making, you know, some ask, right? Um, they usually figure the way out. So I find that even my, action items that I give my team are like very half baked in the sense I'm just doing my best to give you the overall picture and say like, here's here's how I want to paint the scenery. I don't care if the horse is facing me or that side. You figure out what the best way is, and you figure that out, right? And that's how I tend to do it. At Launchable, we kind of took that very seriously, the sense that we are distributed. So my team is in Japan, engineering team is in Japan, and a bunch of us are in the US. And you know what happens when you are like remote and remotely distributed? I see this a lot with Indian companies, um, where people are just staying up late in the evening to catch up, right? In the sense like you're having these one-on-ones. And I had a rule that I want work-life balance for people working for me, and so we try to write a lot. We provide as much context as we can. We write as much we can so that the next person who comes in can read that context and put themselves in my shoes. And then they can take their decisions without having to like check on me whether should they do task A or task B, right?
Yeah, that's a good thing. But then finding time for your reading and then your curiosity, learning, and all that also, balancing that. Because when you say writing,
Uh-huh.
does it take more time than actually getting on a call or using some?
Not quite actually. What writing does for you is like if I got on a call with you right now and you asked me this question, I'm actually having to think about the answer. But if you had asked this question to me on email, I would have spent like about 5-10 minutes thinking about like what the right answer is and written a very concise description of it and provided, more context. And over a period of time, that scales because if I put that out there, I have thought enough, right, on like what the right message is. And that thinking is the most valuable part. It's not the sort of just the interaction, it's the thinking that happens behind it. And writing actually allows you and frees you to do that. Um, Now, the question is like, where do you find the time? And I've been like a productivity hack for for years. You name a productivity book and I've kind of read it and I've experimented with it. But where I ended up with is I think there was this book, The Agile Mind or something like that, which just calls about, write down the top three things you want to do in a day, right? And me being me, top three is not enough, so I have a top three work and I have a top three personal. And I try to get, some of that. um, if I got 3 out of 3, that's great. But even if I got 2 out of 3 on both personal and work front, that usually means I did the most important work ahead. Because what I focused on at that point was not the urgent, but the important stuff. Like the task of like writing the 3 items helps me focus on the urgent, on the important.
See, the one pattern that I have found among
Hmm.
developers
Hmm.
is either reluctance or saying I don't have an aptitude for documentation, which is
Yeah,
in a way communicating, whether it is the specifications or whether it is code related documentation, etc.
yeah.
So, how do you deal that with your teams?
Um, Now I'm senior enough that in some places I can ask for it
Mhm.
and it gets done. But at Launchable, when we started from scratch, we hired for some personalities, right? Some traits that we value as a team. And one of them was the ability to, what Gandhi said, which is be the change you seek. Okay. And the other one was, in amongst those is like, do they have the aptitude to write and communicate? Right. And most people that we hired, we've, hired for these. The couple of people that I had real problems with were people who didn't want to write. Right. It was like, trust me. And I found the hardest, problem with them. And it became very clear that in a longer term perspective, they would not survive. So as a leader, it was my job at that point to impress upon them how the organization rolled and demonstrate that by doing that myself, right? And after a period of time, if they didn't get it, it kind of got onto their, me in a one-on-one, bringing that up with them enough, right? And some of the people who didn't do that, unfortunately didn't survive because it became harder for them to kind of justify like how they're kind of doing their own sort of thing.
Okay. That requires a lot of patience, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm a patient man actually. So that's one of my qualities. So uh, uh, my one of my leadership qualities is I trust people till they break the trust, and versus demanding for trust. And I tend to give people, throw some rope to people to kind of make it up, right? So that certainly goes with my leadership style.
Yeah, nice. Going back a little bit, and when you said that in Indian in Silicon Valley, you had to start up.
Yeah.
So, how did you find the niche?
Yeah. I think it was just enough time in the domain that I have been in. So I've been in the developer experience domain. I was a developer myself, so I understand that pain. No longer a developer, but I still like to think of myself as a dev. And in this iteration, so my background is I'm in continuous integration, continuous deployment, delivery, and so on. And I've helped a number of companies over the last 10 years bring in CI, CD, continuous deployment practices to their organization. And what I found was like I was preaching something and people were implementing that and they're trying to ship software faster. And But even after setting up CI, CD, and DevOps practices, they were not getting wins early enough. And so we sat back, and my co-founder is the creator of Jenkins. So it's a very well-known tool in this domain. And we built, CloudBees together, working for the CEO there. And we sat back and we looked at it and said, like, well, there is a new uh, paradigm coming, AI, machine learning, and this was 5 years back. How can we look at this problem in a new, unique way and find an opportunity to improve things? And out popped an idea. We talked to a number of people and we found that people were doing their things, the same things in their organizations. And we are like, all right, there seems to be a good enough problem. There seems to be an opportunity here, right? So that's how we went about it.
Uh, Maybe at the cost of being a little more technical, but do you want to
Yeah.
explain what is the intelligence element that you have been able to incorporate?
Yeah. I was waiting whether I'm like, too high up in the air or we need to get to specifics. So
Yeah.
getting to specifics here. So when you are building your software delivery pipeline, you have number of tools in the chain, and typically it's run from Jenkins or GitHub Actions or Circle CI or any of the CI tools out there. And once you push some changes in, you run tests, right? You have to run tests all the time. You have to run 100% of the tests 100% of the time, isn't it? And tests take the longest period to execute, right? And we ask the question, why do we need to run these tests 100% of the times?
Mm.
Can we use machine learning or AI to cut that down, right? So that was our starting hypothesis. And what we came to was like, well, we can use machine learning and we can look at your code changes and predict what tests are likely to fail.
Mm.
So then the question is, gee, if I can predict what tests are likely to fail, why do I need to run all of them all of the time? You don't, right? So we built a product that can look at your code changes coming in and predict what tests are likely to fail within certain confidence that you specify, and then we'll give you the list of tests that you need to run, right? And you execute them, and you can actually cut the test down like anywhere from like 10 to 80% depending on your risk threshold.
Mhm.
So that's what we do. That's where we started off with. And what we found along the way is that where people are really struggling with is like triaging the issues, the failures that happen.
Mhm.
And they were looking at us as a mechanism of shortening the fire hose that is coming their way. And they're like, all right, we'll cut this test down. This is going faster. The dev feedback loop is going faster. And when failures happen, I can triage it. So now we are sort of adding to what we built and building something called intelligent test failure diagnostics that can look at these signals, use Gen AI and machine learning, and automatically classify uh, these failures into underlying issues,
Yeah.
right? And so that's what we're doing at the moment.
Wow. Yeah. Sounds very interesting. So, how much of this needs the understanding of, let's say, the developer's mindset? We have different styles of coding that people tend to do at a very high level, whether it is in a defensive programming or general cowboyish programming, or individuals tend to use certain structures, certain architectures, and so on. Uh, the the possibility of making mistakes, or
Yeah.
when you said whether it is trashing or trying to at least look at the impact of what this could cause. Uh, how much of that is influenced by the programming style?
Um, so answer is none, and I'm thinking whether that's a right answer. The place where we come in is you already have tests written. So presumably you have tests written because you've written the code and you know these are the areas to fail in and catch those. If you haven't quite written the tests, or like your program, we don't kind of come in. So in some
Okay.
ways we are
Mhm.
one step away from like what is your actual coding style. We are
Mhm.
not looking at it. In fact, like the machine learning approach kept us language and test framework independent,
Okay.
right? And so we think in terms of generalizations. That's sort of our DNA. And our thing was like, if you look into the testing frameworks, there's every week there's a new testing framework that comes in for a new specific language and so on. And we were stepping back and say, like, how can we build a general purpose solution that can map across test frameworks, across languages, with the idea that once you brought into this organization, maybe like, this Java code here could
Mhm.
do well with this kind of stuff. But you know what? The world is heterogeneous.
Mhm.
So you brought it here, and the next team is using Python. You can just say, like, well, let's bring in the launchable approach here without kind of worrying about, like, well, this is Python, and like, this is not static analysis. This is static analysis. I just work with one language, one framework. So
Mhm.
we've intentionally stepped away from it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Uh, Now, with this, many teams are also kind of, constrained by a launch date.
Uh-huh.
They start with that. And since testing usually happens at the end, that is what usually gets compromised. Now, when you said the ability to triage and also pick the tests that are most relevant, is that something that is a use case that you've
Yeah.
seen?
Uh, Frankly, not. Those kinds of people get weeded out,
Mm.
right? Because when you're a startup, the kinds of people engaging with you are on the somewhat on the leading edge of things.
Mhm.
And for our approach to work, you need to test at least, once or twice, maybe a couple of times a week. So the kinds of people who engage with us are really into continuous integration, They have like automated test suites. They're working with stuff. It's not like one guy sitting somewhere, manually poking things around. Like that's not a use case that we actually solve for, right?
Okay.
So you are a leading edge in terms, at least aspirationally. You're trying to move ahead. You have automated tests, and now you're trying to figure out like how can I get most bang for the buck here, right? Um, the triaging aspect that I just told about, like, where we are using Gen AI, can technically be used with those tools, but uh, we haven't quite, we haven't quite talked to those sets of people and sort
Hmm.
of bringing them on at the moment.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So in terms of roadmap, since you
Mhm.
said Gen AI and all that, where do you see this whole uh, aspect of testing going?
Well, that's a very visionary question. I think people are, specifically with Gen AI, people are still trying to figure things out.
Hmm.
One of the most obvious use cases that people talked to us about was like generate test cases.
Hmm.
Okay, and because we are not, we don't have enough test cases to write. Beyond that, people haven't quite figured out. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud about is like this notion of classifying failures and getting to the root cause of failures and using Gen AI to do that is a very unique lens that we've taken. I haven't yet come across many people thinking about that way, right? Um, I don't know where, you know, this particular road will take, the Gen AI road, but if you step back and you ask me how we think about sort of where the testing world will go with AI machine learning, our philosophy was like there are lots of opportunities in your testing pipeline. It's like a set of testing that happens and code commits in and you're passing through various gates, right? And one of the gates that you talked about, oh, it's towards the end and like we are going to find it. Our approach was like, we think of this as like a manual stick shift that is happening at each of these gates. If we could just make this completely automated, just as with cars, what if like I pushed my change in and that test that was in the last sort of gate, can I run that much earlier because the machine
Yeah.
learning can predict like that's going to fail, so bring that up, right? And that's the kind of intelligence that you kind of want to sort of bring in, right? And then I think it's going to play a very AI co-pilot kind of world where there's so much of non-automation or like work that is non-automated that can easily be automated, right? So an example, I'll just talk to our use case because that's specific enough and that's credible, and I feel like it's not like hand waving, right? When a developer pushes change or like a QA runs a test and the test fails, the first question that you get out of it is like, well, I have 500 failures. Are these 500 failures failing because like they were all talking to a database and there's one issue because the database is unplugged, or there are 500 issues, right? And so what people tend to do is they go to you know their logs, they go through various stack traces, somebody stitches them mentally, and then they come in and says, 1 250 and 350 and 500 seem to be feeling the same way, right? And what we are sort of working towards, and this is in beta at the moment, is, oh, we'll immediately tell you based on this that 1 250 and 500 are failing in the same way, and if you fix that issue, it fixes it.
Yeah.
And so if I up level this, it's those kinds of automation things that have been done manually is where AI is going to come in and start sort of making things much much smarter and
Mm.
tuning it. And I would think that the next 2 years are like those kind of use cases rolling out.
Yeah, wonderful. You kind of partly answered a question that was coming in my mind as you were describing this, which
Uh-huh,
is since you talk about DevOps as well, everyone talks
uh-huh,
about shifting left. And you
uh-huh,
also said that can we do these tests in an automated manner earlier, not at the end, and so on.
uh-huh.
So the question that came to my mind was, if you're able to detect some patterns, or if you're able to detect some root causes, can something be given as guidance for the developers or the architects
Uh-huh.
to kind of make their designs better, make their implementations better, so that you can avoid some of these failures? Since you mentioned GenAI,
Yeah.
I'm assuming that this engine can also learn as it understands more and more of these scenarios and what happens and finding some patterns, etc.
Yeah. So uh, the way I think about it is yes, but maybe not more in direct lines of like how we were think in our world. So I'm just going to up level, an altitude from here, right? So you have GitHub Copilot. I haven't looked at it in the recent, few months, but the idea is they are looking at, code bases all over the place, right? And, you have security issues and those follow a pattern and they can pull that in and recommend fixes to you much earlier, right? So I do think to your question, those are capabilities that will come up where you can sort of recommend people that you're building this and this library is not quite up to speed, you should probably move to this one, or you're using um, you know a library that is security incompliant or whatnot. So there is opportunity to do that. How much of that is coming in from like the test that you wrote,
Mhm.
going very specific to my domain? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's fine. It's just a curiosity question, as I said, no, that came to my mind,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
so many things happening, and we find that many of these breakthroughs are, when some orthogonals kind of intersect. Yeah, okay, that
yeah. But like for like your overarching case was like shifting left, right?
yeah.
So the product that we landed with, where I is called predictive test selection,
Mhm,
right? And predictive test selection's premise really was like, can I predict what tests are likely to fail and shift them left,
mhm,
right? And you can, right? So think of this
mhm,
as like smoke tests.
mhm,
Somebody manually curates smoke tests, but what
mhm.
if, could dynamically curate smoke tests? And
Yeah,
then you can run them right up front. And then those tests are shifted as left, right up to their pull request.
right.
And some of our customers are actually using it that way,
Mhm,
right? It's like, okay, this was a nightly test, and now I'm going to make this part of the pull request. And then every
mhm,
time some developer checks in, for
mhm,
5 minutes, we're going to run the tests
mhm.
and we'll catch 90% of the failing bills. So they don't have to wait the whole night, to come in tomorrow morning and see a failure. So some of that, we've been doing it now for like 4 years. It's just as like people are waking up to it now, right?
Interesting. Because one of my seniors in college, who
Uh-huh.
later on went to IBM Research, he came up with this model, which is now called as the ODC, the orthogonal
Uh-huh.
defect classification,
Okay.
which is essentially a way of using both qualitative and quantitative measurements to classify software defects. This
Mm-hmm.
is a paper published from IBM Research in those days. Uh,
Uh-huh.
so the um, the defects themselves are probably pointing to some gaps in thinking or collective thinking, and trying to classify them is probably one order higher in terms of complexity. Trying to
Right.
even find that. Yeah, so I find it very fascinating that anybody working in this area
Yeah.
and the kind of things that you're doing. Uh,
Yeah. I think the tech is finally there that we can
mm,
do it. So when we built the roadmap of the company before we started it, me and Kosuke, who's my co-founder, the creator of Jenkins, we were talking about some of these use cases
mm,
and the ability to classify your failures based on exceptions in your log files.
mhm,
It was not easy to build, but
mm,
Gen AI lets us do that, right? It's still not that easy to build, but like we can do that, right? And our next set of action items are like our customers are telling us, well, I get that, but can you now tell me if this is a server failure, or this is a client side failure, or this is an infra failure? And we are like, yeah, absolutely. We just need to type that in now. And so the tech, has moved enough that we can kind of go do these use cases.
So coming back to Harpreet as a person,
Uh-huh.
um, see when we interact with people who are providing a lot of service to others, particularly if you take medical or some, let's say a psychologist or even a doctor, when they see a lot of cases where trauma needs to be handled, and then they are there, but they don't get sucked in doing all that, it does have an impact on them.
Uh-huh.
They need to also recover from that or take a step back and so on. So,
Uh-huh.
as a person or as an organization that you build that looks at a lot of failures most of the time, or trying to avoid that and so on, uh, over your career, what you've seen as the state of software development, do you think it is maturing, or it's still kind of probably using different technologies, but still in pretty much the shape that it was when you started?
The long trajectory of things is like things are always improving,
Mhm.
right? For example, when I was coding, continuous integration wasn't a thing, right? It became a thing in my organization. Jenkins was invented by Kosuke in my organization, so I happened to be on the leading edge of things there. Um, but if you had sort of moved the dial back, and at that point we were talking about releasing software in every 6 to 8 months, and we felt we were doing pretty good at it. And now, if you go and tell somebody that you have a release cycle of 8 months, they'll be like, What the hell are you doing? You're like,
Mhm.
uh, you're obsolete."
Mhm.
So I think the state of the world continuously is improving in these areas. But at the same time, there's some problems that still remain, right? Um, it's like the key underlying jobs to be done framework. It's like a QA person at that point in time was still triaging issues, and he was probably looking at a different set of tool chains, and maybe that's improved a bit, but that's introduced a whole bunch of new issues. So there's always, the core underlying key jobs does not radically change,
Mhm.
but in general, it continues improving, and it introduces a whole new set of problems that there is opportunity to improve. So seems like I'm answering from both sides of the mouth, but I generally feel like the state of the art has changed. Like who would, with Kubernetes, who would think that you could deploy, at scale?
Right.
And I came to the US to do masters in AI. And when
Mhm.
I came on, there was not enough data to actually do it, right? The
Mhm.
only data that you would do it with was like the US Air Force programs, and like they were um, not easily available, right? And now like any person can, I was just looking on YouTube today morning, like which machine learning course should I sort of dip my toes into? And there are 10,000 people talking about 10,000 different machine learning problems. So like it's just, I guess that's what I find fantastic about computer science and computer engineering and like this tech world. There's just so much innovation that happens all the time that it beats every other industry out.
Yeah, that's in a way very encouraging. There is still work to do on the back end. And that is not just the solutions, but also how the solutions are being created.
Yeah.
So also, we are kind of nearing our time for this
Uh-huh.
conversation. So one question that I would like to ask my guests is your career advice or career tips for two segments of people. You can probably focus it on whether getting into the testing space or it could be more generic. So one segment is those who are considering a career in IT today. Is there still something to look forward to for them? And the other is typically what we may call as those who are going through a midlife crisis. After some time, whether it's a question of should I be a manager or should I continue to be technical, or what am I doing with all this? Do I want to change my line, maybe from developer to tester or tester to a product manager, and so on and so forth?
Yeah. So for people who are getting into the tech world, I somehow never use IT because it just seems very old school in terms of. So I'll use tech, right? Um, I don't think any industry evolves as fast as we do. So if you have a penchant for learning new things and you have to constantly upgrade your skill set and constantly sort of keep improving, if that's a background, like then it's a fantastic place to be in. But that's the mindset you want. You can't be a person who's like, all right, I did my college and like, I'm going to use this, piece of uh, work or thing for the rest of my life. That's not going to work. But if you like get excited by new sets of problems, there's just a lot of things that are going on. So there's no better way. And I somehow disagree with some of the things that are happening where people are saying like, well, you know what, programming is going to be completely outdated. Not likely in the near future, right? So there's just plenty of opportunity. To people who are on the second track, which is you're in midlife and then you're trying to figure out whether you want to continue on or like do you change tracks. So somebody who was a dev who went into product management, I've run design, I've done pre-sales, I've done sales, I've done marketing, and now I'm an entrepreneur. uh, I think the right question, and coming as an Indian, um, the right question to ask yourself is, are you what are you passionate about? Most people, as we as Indians, don't ask that. We as Indians make this question: should I be a manager or should I not be a manager or should I do this? And the question to ask is like, what really gets you, right? And if you find that is not what you're doing today, then kind of go do something else, right? In my particular case, I found that I worked at Sun, which was the Google of its days, the best people, best engineers. I was an engineer, but we just couldn't make money. And I was like, why can't we make money? So I'm going to go to business school and go figure that out. And that's what I did, right? And sort of building and monetizing businesses became my passion. And that's sort of fast forward 15 years later, that's how I am a CEO of this company, right? So go find that. And midlife crisis is the best place to do that because you now have enough to understand various aspects in the business, and come back and look at yourself and go like, okay, maybe this developer thing is, I'm kind of done with it, but like this marketing thing is more shiny and I can help there because I like it, not because it has more dollars. uh, yeah, that would be my advice.
Yeah, that's a great advice. And I'm sure that people who've been asking these kinds of questions, by the way, they do keep asking this over the last 5+ years of the podcast.
Yeah,
There are people who come and say that, oh, I found what he said is very relevant and relatable. So I think a lot of people are going through this, and for coming from someone who has actually been there, done that, I'm sure it's
yeah.
going to be very useful for them. Thanks a lot, Harpreet, for taking the time,
All right,
sharing your story. And yeah, all the best to Launchable.
thank you for having me here.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.